Courts and state officials are tussling over it. The Supreme Court will rule on it this spring. What is about to happen to marriage? This is the CitizenLink report. I'm Stuart Shepard, along with Bruce Hausknecht, who watches over the courts for Focus on the Family. Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Stuart.
I've really been looking forward to this conversation with you to help us all understand where we are and where we're headed concerning marriage. I want to start out by playing a clip from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the Supreme Court justices, who did an interview just last week and talked about marriage. She said, when it comes to redefinition, Americans will just get used to it.
So I think it would not take a large adjustment, and of course we shouldn't speak much more about this subject because one way or another it will be decided before we leave town in June.
Now, Bruce, I don't know a lot about Supreme Court protocol, but it seems like it's a little out of place for a justice to be talking about a topic that they're currently considering and will be ruling on very shortly.
Well, it's an ethical breach, really. Justices are supposed to follow codes of ethics. One of those is don't talk about a case before you decide on it, because you could telegraph how you're going to decide it, which then breaches everyone's idea of what an impartial court looks like. So she did that.
And it also strikes me that she says Americans will get used to it, will adapt to it, but that's not the test for a Supreme Court justice to use. It's not whether Americans will get used to what we push upon them. It's something else, which is?
It's what the Constitution says. This is all about what the Constitution requires, and the Constitution is silent on the subject of marriage.
Not a single word.
No, zero.
Now, help us understand what challenges are out there right now. We've got this one set of cases before the Supreme Court. There are a couple others down in the circuits. Let's talk about where we are.
Well, that's right. Most people are familiar with the 4 states that are already at the Supreme Court. You have Michigan, Ohio, Tennessee, and Kentucky. But there are 3 cases in the 5th Circuit down in New Orleans from Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana that have been argued and will be decided shortly. Same thing with the 8th Circuit. And the 8th Circuit is looking at South Dakota, Missouri, Arkansas.
South Dakota, Arkansas, Missouri.
Right. And so those cases, the court has said they will decide on a fast track, which means we could have 6 more cases decided before the Supreme Court decides the ones already there.
Does it tell us anything that knowing the Supreme Court will soon be ruling on this, that the circuit courts below are trying to get a decision in before that happens, perhaps?
It could. A lot of the circuit courts want to get their opinions on record so that perhaps it could influence the Supreme Court. A lot of those circuit courts are very proud of what they do as judges, and they don't like having issues like same-sex marriage imposed upon them.
Now, one of the states that's been getting a lot of attention over the last few weeks is Alabama. A federal district judge, that's the lowest level court, threw out their constitutional marriage amendment, which had been passed by an 81% vote of the people. The state officials, Chief Justice Roy Moore, who is the head of the state Supreme Court there, as well as the governor, are saying, we don't have to pay any attention. We can ignore what the federal court says. Tell us what that's all about.
Well, it's all about having 2 separate systems of government, a state government and a federal government. U.S. Constitution applies to federal actions, and the state constitution applies to state actions. And then when you get issues like marriage, where it's governed by state law, but courts are throwing it out based on what the U.S. Constitution says, you have a clash of jurisdictions, and that's why we've got Alabama resisting what the Supreme Court apparently wants to impose on them.
And as we pointed out just a moment ago, the U.S. Constitution says nothing about marriage, but the Alabama Constitution does and spells it out in no uncertain terms how they define marriage.
It certainly does, and not only does the state constitution define marriage as one man and one woman, but if you'll remember back to 2013, we had a huge marriage case at the Supreme Court called Windsor, in which Justice Kennedy wrote the opinion and threw out the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriage as one man and one woman. And he said, in throwing that out, it's a state issue. However the states decide, especially if they decide that same-sex marriage is the law of that state, the federal government must be bound by that. Now, apparently, the federal judges since Windsor are saying, well, apparently you don't have the right to decide marriage as a state So who does have the power to decide what marriage is?
And to be clear what that's coming from, there is an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that spells out that if it's not specified, if it's not enumerated, to use the exact language in the U.S. Constitution, it's reserved to the states or to the people.
You're talking about the 10th Amendment and to some extent the 9th Amendment as well. The U.S. Constitution sets out a form of limited federal authority, and the states have all the rest, if you can picture that. But we have a system now, 200 years later, that's almost the reverse of that. So that's why marriage is such a big case of what is called federalism, state versus federal authority.
Now, Ruth Bader Ginsburg says they will have a decision before they leave town in June. What should we be watching over the next 4 months leading up to that?
Well, watch for those other federal decisions out of the 8th Circuit and the 5th Circuit, and watch for oral arguments at the Supreme Court in late April, and we will probably get that decision out of the Supreme Court probably the last week of June.
All right. We'll be watching it from here as well, as you would expect. Bruce, thank you for your insights. Very helpful.
You're welcome, Stuart.
And thank you for watching. We always appreciate hearing from you. You may write to us at mail@citizenlink.com. And do pray for the 9 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. Find their names online. Pray for each of them individually. Some of them take that living document view of the Constitution. Some are originalists. Pray for all of them that they would have wisdom as they decide on the definition of marriage for the United States of America. And remember to stand tall and be heard.